Now, whenever I go away and I'm coming back to Maine, if I'm driving, there's a moment that I always enjoy. It is as I am crossing the river from New Hampshire into Maine. And I'm looking at all these nodding heads. We all know what that's like. You cross in about halfway through the river, you go, I'm home. And even though I still got another, 50, 60, 70 miles to go, it still feels like home. The river's a border. This side is Maine, and on that side is New Hampshire. This side is us. Everything on the other side is them. Now, I know I've told you over and over again that there is no them, there's only us, but sometimes it feels that way. So, rivers, and we're going to talk about some rivers today, but rivers are often borders. They generally are a barrier between two places. They mark off one city from another, and some are easy to get across, some are not. Some are state boundaries, some are international borders, but rivers often mark a border. And one of these is this river. Have you ever been across this river? The Androscoggin River marks the border between what? Lewiston and Auburn. And how many of you have crossed that border in the last 72 hours? It's about everywhere. How often do you cross it and not even think about the fact that you're crossing a border between two cities? And it's not just two cities, because there was a time when the difference between Lewiston and Auburn was significant. In fact, it still is, as we saw in last election where we were talking about combining the two cities. It still is. What was the difference between, let's see, which direction are we looking at here? Between Auburn and Lewiston. No, Lewiston and Auburn. Where are we? Right there. That's us. What was the difference between the two cities? What was it, Shelley? Oh, because there was a significant one.
Auburn is cleaner and Lewiston is dirtier.
Cleaner and dirtier. I have friends who I wouldn't say that to, but I know what you're talking about. Carolyn, what's the difference? French Catholic and not French Catholic, but that in itself is a function of the real difference. What was the difference?
Owners and workers.
Yes. This side of the river, wait a minute, where am I again? Yeah, this side of the river, Lewiston. This is where the workers lived. And this side of the river over here is where the owners and the bosses lived. And that was a huge divide between them. Socially, that was extremely significant. And crossing from one side of the river to the other might have been as easy as walking across the bridge. But crossing from being a person who lived in Lewiston and a person who lived in Auburn was not an easy bridge to cross. That river was a barrier. And for many years, maybe more than 100 years, there were people on the Lewiston side of the river who looked across that river and thought to themselves, I wonder if I will ever live on the other side, ever. This church had a reputation at one time, didn't it? I heard it before when I got here. I don't think it's ours anymore, but this was the rich people's church. The churches on the Lewiston side were not called that. This one was. I hope nobody thinks of it that way. I'm quite sure the members of our AF&S committee who put the budget together every year do not think of it that way, but it once was. That was a major barrier. We read today about this woman, Lydia. She was a dealer in purple. Purple was a dye that was not easy to get in Jesus' time. You had to be an Auburn kind of a person to wear purple. Lewiston people didn't get to wear it. And Lydia was a Jewish woman living in a Greek city. Now the significance of this is the river on which she lived, the Carnahan River, was not a big river. It didn't mark off a barrier, but she went there regularly to pray. And this is nothing new. All over the world there are rivers where people go to pray. Sometimes just a little creek like in my daughter's backyard. Sometimes a major river like the Ganges or the Jordan. People gather at rivers to pray. And this is what Lydia did. But the significance of this was this, that she met St. Paul. He wasn't known as St. Paul then, just Paul. She met him there, and he talked to her and taught her about Jesus, and she became a believer in Jesus. And that means that she was the first Christian believer in Europe. All the previous Christian churches had been in the Middle East or in what we now call Turkey. Somehow they crossed the border into Europe and began to change the world. Lydia was one of the first people to begin this process of changing the whole world to the following Jesus. Right there by the Carnahan River, nobody knew it was as important as it was. One of the other readings was about when the Hebrew people crossed the Jordan River, centuries and centuries before what we just talked about. The people of Israel had been slaves in Egypt. Everybody remembers this. And they were able to escape from slavery. They spent a long time as a nomadic people living in the Sinai desert, and eventually came to the edge of the Jordan, approaching the Jordan River from the east. And on the other side was the land that we still today know as Israel. Back then, Palestine was the name of it, but the Jordan River was the border between the desert lands on one side and the fertile land on the other. And this was where the people had been headed. All this time that they had been escaping from slavery, they had been headed for a promised land. They'd heard about it, they'd been told it was coming, and now here they were at the very edge of the river, ready to cross. And what they did was, the priests gathered together this chest, this also known perhaps as the Ark of the Covenant, is maybe the way you know it. And they carried that out into the middle of the river, which caused the river to stop flowing somehow. And in the middle of the river, they took 12 large stones, and they built an altar with those stones. And when the whole people had crossed over, the river started to flow again, and those stones remained there to remind the people that once we lived on that side, where we were slaves and nomads, people without a home, and now God has brought us over the Jordan River into the promised land, this land that is fertile and productive, this place where we can live in peace. That was how they crossed the Jordan. The Mississippi River is also a border. Kind of cuts the country right in half. How many of you ever lived west of the Mississippi? Anybody? Okay, well, not too many of us, a few of us. I think most of us have. Raymond has. I know he has. He's west of the Mississippi and south of the Missouri there, where you were. One of the things about the Missouri River is it marks the border, a good hunk of its length is the border between Missouri and Illinois. And that was a significant border 150 years ago. What was the difference between the west side of the Mississippi and the east side? Slavery. Everybody in Maine knows that Missouri was a slave state, right? Okay, we all understand why. If you don't understand, ask a Mainer why that's important to us, but it is. Missouri was a slave state, and if you were in Missouri and you looked east, you could see the Mississippi River in front of you, and on the other side of that very wide, mile-wide river was Illinois, and Illinois was a free state. And if you were a slave standing there, you could look across that river and you could see where freedom was, but you couldn't get there. How many slaves do you think died trying to cross the Mississippi River? How many did that? And how many were caught and brought back and then sold further south down the Mississippi River, where both sides were slavery? But that was an important thing. There was a town on the Missouri border known as Hannibal, Missouri, that raised one of the most famous Americans. Who was it? Mark Twain. And many of his stories involved that. His most famous story, perhaps Huckleberry Finn, about a trip down that river. A trip down that river where the question was, would the slave Jim that was traveling with him somehow get to the other side before they passed the opportunity for him to be free? The Mississippi River is a significant social barrier in our country. I walked across the Alabama River That river right there. Right now, the Alabama River is out of control. It is flooding everything down there. It's overrun its banks. It's flooding. When I was there a few weeks ago, it looked pretty much like that. I walked across that bridge known as the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Does anybody know who Edmund Pettus was? Well, he was a local politician and in Selma, Alabama, and then in the statewide, he was well known, and one of the significant key figures in the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama, and got a bridge named after himself right there in Selma. And 60-some years ago, John Lewis and a few others had the courage to cross that bridge in a march to Montgomery, Alabama, to go talk to the governor. What did they want to talk to the governor about? Well, specifically what? I heard it. Voting rights. They were being denied their right to vote where they lived, and they had decided they would walk to the governor and talk to him about it. And they set out across that bridge right there to cross the Alabama River, which isn't a border river, it's just the river. They wanted to cross that river, and when they got to the other side, they were met by, as John Lewis described it, a sea of blue. Police officers from Selma and from the state who attacked them, beat them, hit them with nightsticks, trampled them with horses, chased them back through the streets of Selma, including killing one member of that group that was just trying to march to freedom. The Alabama River marked the border between oppression and freedom. And when they finally were able to get across with the help of Dr. King, they were finally able to cross that river safely and go and present their petition for protecting their voting rights to the governor. And who was the governor? Oh, you know him. George Wallace, who did not care to grant them their petition. But it was a significant moment because it was people standing up and saying, we are crossing this border. We're crossing this bridge, crossing this river. I'm glad they were able to do it. Somewhere in all of the process of our nation's history, the Jordan River became identified as the barrier between slavery and freedom. It's not here, of course, in the United States, but in the Bible, it was that border, slavery on one side, freedom on the other. And in the small wooden churches throughout the South, the black congregations would speak of crossing the Jordan, talk about their hope of one day getting over to the other side of that river where they could be free for the first time in their lives. And they talked about the Jordan River as that barrier between us and our freedom. And it took on an even deeper significance than that, too, because some people realized that there was only one way they were ever going to be freed from the slavery chains that bound them, and that was when they died. When they finally came to the point of death, they would then finally be able to be free from those who held them prisoner. So crossing the Jordan became a metaphor for death. To cross over the Jordan meant to enter into the land where Christ would receive you and welcome you and love you, where you would be free of all your pains and all your sorrows, not just your slavery, but all of the pains that had connected to it, all of the losses that came because your family was enslaved and some of them were sold away, all of the beatings that took place because you were property, all of that could finally be taken away. All of that struggle in life would be taken away when you got to the Jordan River. When you got down to the Jordan River, you could lay down your chains and your weapons and your tools and your pains and your sorrows. Lay them all down and pass into the world of peace. Last week, I visited my mom down in Baltimore. And she is there at that point, I hope. She is close now to the edge of the Jordan River in that way. She's not well. Her mind is clear. She knows where she is, who she is. She talks with people, but it's difficult for her to talk because everything in her body is in pain. Everything hurts her to speak. And someday soon, she's going to cross that river, Jordan. She's going to lay down all the struggle of just trying to stay alive and let that go and be a resting point. And so are you. And some of you are a lot closer to it than others. Bella, I hope you're 70 or 80 years away from it at this point. But everybody comes to it. And someday, you will get to lay down your sword and shield down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. I'll study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I won't study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, you're invited to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, starting at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC, where you'll find the video version of Steve's sermons as well. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day. May God's blessings rest upon you now and always. See you next week.